So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our online webinar. So you're thinking of getting solar panels, where we're going to cover all things solar energy. We'll be talking about Solar Together, which is a London-wide scheme for group buying of solar panels and some of the benefits and a bit more about that scheme. And then actually what that means locally in terms of planning permission or planning consent. But before we get started, I'm delighted to welcome Councillor Wesley Harcourt, Cabinet Member for Environment. So over to Councillor Harcourt to say a few welcoming words.
Great. Many thanks, Emily. My goodness, what an incredible number of people here this morning. So, firstly, many thanks for joining us today. It's clear just from the sheer numbers who are here today, just how important the issue of solar panels and renewable energy is to everybody. Normally when we talk about carbon emissions, people immediately start thinking about cars, lorries, traffic. But the truth of the matter is, it's actually buildings that are the biggest source of carbon emissions across Hammersmith and Fulham. Now, the council set a target of net zero carbon by 2030, but even setting that target, we still have to heat and power our buildings, and that's going to involve switching from fossil fuels to renewable sources. Now, we're committed to making this as easy as possible for households to make that switch. Generating your own renewable energy has so many benefits, and solar panels are going to help households save money on energy bills and increase our reliance on UK produced energy, which is something that is really, really important given the sort of situations that we're hearing about on the news at the moment. Now, solar panels also help cut carbon emissions, and they're a key step in our journey to building the greenest borough. But whatever else we say about that, it's always going to be a challenge. There's so many questions. And so today we've got officers from across the council who are going to explain the different ways that we can support you and help you get on the journey to installing solar power or renewable energy. We're going to hear about the Solar Together scheme, which pools group buying power so you can get a much better price for everybody. There'll be some information about the planning rules, planning considerations, and how we can help you understand if you're going to need planning permission. But of course, it's not just about us telling you everything. There's going to be lots and lots of questions, and we're really looking forward to that, to make this as many ways as interactive as we can. Recently, this council is named as the top council in London for our climate strategy, and we're determined to make sure that that translates into action and that we lead the way on cutting carbon and building a cleaner, greener borough for all of us. Now, that's enough from me, really. All I can say is I hope you find this session informative and that you're prepared to join us on this transition to locally produced renewable energy here in Hammersmith and Fulham. Many thanks, and I'll hand you back to Emily.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Councillor Harcourt, for the introduction and for being with us this morning. So what we're going to cover today, we will hear from Tim, who's the Clean Energy Lead in the Climate Unit, about an introduction to solar energy and the role of solar in reaching net zero and different types of solar energy. I will then be talking through Solar Together, which is this London-wide scheme supported by Mayor of London that we're supporting the local uptake of here in Hammersmith and Fulham. And then Roy, our colleague from planning, will be talking through some planning considerations before we get to a Q&A where Svea will be facilitating grouping questions and asking those of us on the call. So I think as we get started, I'll hand over to Tim.
Thank you very much, Emily, and thank you also, Councillor Harcourt. So yes, I am as Emily said, I lead on clean energy, including solar, and I'm just going to talk very quickly through solar energy and what it is and some of the kind of considerations you might want to bear in mind if you're thinking about installing some kind of solar panels on your house. Next slide, please, Emily. Sorry, as you gathered, I'm not driving the slides here. As Councillor Harcourt mentioned, this all really fits underneath our climate and ecology strategy, and we're really proud that this was independently assessed, our strategy, as the best in London by an organisation called Climate Emergency UK. So we're really proud of our strategy, and it's super, super ambitious with a net zero target by 2030. And again, as Councillor Harcourt said, of the priorities we've got, this slide lists out the key areas in our climate strategy, if anything, the most important one is top left there, homes, building and energy, because that's where most of our emissions come from. And that's really what we're talking about today, is reducing emissions from the energy you use in your home, and also following on from the councillor's comments, increasing the reliance on energy we produce within the UK and locally, which I think, given the geopolitical situation right now, is kind of super important. Other priorities in our strategy are transport, the things we buy and use, and also the things we invest in as well, things like our pensions, protecting biodiversity and making space for nature, and adapting to climate change. And there was a recent, some of you might be aware, a recent report out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last week, talking about the climate change impacts that we will need to adapt to. Next slide, please, Emily. So when we talk about solar energy, what people almost always mean is solar photovoltaics, or solar PV, which is what people usually call them for short. And that basically means using solar panels to generate electricity. That's kind of 95% plus of the solar energy installations in the UK. And it will usually involve installing panels like the ones in the picture on the right there, on the roof of your house, ideally on a roof that faces that kind of some kind of southerly aspect between about southeast and southwest, but you can install them on east and west facing roofs as well. It just might not be quite as cost effective. The cost of an installation, I mean, this is something you can only really get a good idea of by getting a qualified installer around through a scheme like Solar Together, but typically at the moment, somewhere between £5,000 and £10,000, depending on the size of your roof, the number of solar panels you want to install, whether there's kind of additional things you need to do, like strengthening your roof, and a kind of really crucial factor, whether you include a battery to store that electricity in your installation or not. And I'll talk a little bit more about whether you might want to do that in a moment. A new thing that's kind of just coming on the market at the moment, the kind of bottom point there on this slide, is solar roof tiles. And I've got a picture of those on the next slide. This is not something you can get through Solar Together, and it's very unusual at the moment. You rarely see it. And the reason you rarely see it is there are very few suppliers, and it's very expensive at the moment, but it's just starting to come on the market more. I was at a conference in the Excel last week, and I met a new supplier there who's starting up in the UK in next January, installing solar roof tiles. I think the message around solar roof tiles is it's only viable if you're replacing your entire roof anyway. If you're not thinking of replacing your roof within the next 5 to 10 years, I just wouldn't go there. Some considerations around what you might want to think of for solar PV. So again, this is using solar panels to generate electricity. Probably one of the biggest is your roof, where you're going to install it. What is the size of your roof? What is the angle of your roof? Kind of an angle around 30 degrees is ideal, but again, you can work with kind of much steeper or much shallower roofs. And you can definitely install solar PV on flat roofs as well. And what usually people will do then is angle the panels a little bit up from horizontal towards the south, so they can get more of the sun's energy. A really crucial consideration is whether your roof is overshadowed. So if you have tall buildings overshadowing you, or trees overshadowing you, it makes it harder. It doesn't make it impossible, but it makes it more difficult to install solar PV on your roof. I talked a little bit about the strength earlier. Some roofs, particularly older roofs that were designed to take slate tiles, might need reinforcing before you put solar panels on, but that's something an installer can advise you about. Exposure, I've just been talking about, that basically means whether it's overshadowed or not. Second point there, how much electricity do you consume? And it's very important when you use it as well, because solar PV works best when you self-consume, you consume in your house the electricity that you generate. So it works best when you have technology in your house that will usefully use that electricity as it's being generated. So that's why technologies like heat pumps, that's using electricity to heat your house, work very well with solar PV. It can work very well if you have an electric vehicle, because you can use it to charge your car. Smart plugs are a technology you can use to time when your appliances come on. So you can set your washing machine, for instance, to come on during the middle of the day when the sun is shining. if it's harder for you to use that electricity as it's generated, that's when it becomes worthwhile thinking about installing a battery with your system. Because if you're not around during the day, you're not using that electricity during the day, a battery will then enable you to store that energy and use it in the evening when you are around. So that's kind of one of the key considerations to think about whether you want to install a battery. Another thing you can do if you've got a hot water tank is you can install a clever little gadget that will detect when you're not using the electricity and use it to heat your hot water. Failing all of that, kind of the last resort is something called a smart export guarantee, which basically means you are guaranteed to be able to sell the electricity you generate to the grid, but you won't get such a good price for it as avoiding buying the electricity in the first place, which is why it's better to use it yourself or store it. Again, through a scheme like Solar Together, I think an installer would be able to kind of give you more advice on this kind of thing for your specific circumstances, but those are some of the things to bear in mind. Very quickly, because I'm conscious of time, there are different types of solar panels. So I don't mean here just whether they're tiles or big panels. I mean the actual silicon technology in the panel. So some cost more, and monocrystalline ones are more expensive but more efficient. Some, like nanotechnology, thin film solar panels, are a bit cheaper and a bit lighter. There's no wrong answer here. They're all good. It's just something worth bearing in mind and knowing what you're getting. Maintenance, generally super easy. They might need cleaning, at most once a year. They may well not need cleaning at all if they're not kind of overhung by any trees or anything. You might need to replace a couple of, they should last about 25 years or at least 25 years, but you might need to replace a couple of bits of kit around and like the inverter after less time than that, but that's not a major expense. And then planning permission is obviously a consideration as well, which my colleague is going to talk about shortly. Next slide, please, Emily. And then much more briefly here, because it's a much more simple technology and it's not covered by Solar Together, but just worth being aware that when people talk about solar energy, there is a different type called solar thermal. It's much less versatile than solar PV because it only produces heat, whereas obviously if you've got a solar PV panel on your roof, you can use that to produce electricity, and then you can use that electricity to produce heat. So you can't use this to power your television or your appliances or your washing machine. It's cheaper, it's smaller, it's something to consider perhaps if you've got less roof space, or you can even wall mount them if you've got a south-facing wall. So it's something, if you're kind of space constrained, might be worth considering. You have to have a hot water tank because you're generating hot water. I mean, people do occasionally use these to space heat, to heat the air in their homes, but it's a kind of pretty rare thing to do. Normally they use them to heat hot water. Again, there are different types of solar thermal panel out there, and the one you want in the UK is the one I've got pictured there, which is called evacuated tube solar thermal, because it works better in a colder climate. Or I should kind of say that all these technologies, they work well in the UK. Even on a cloudy day, both solar thermal and solar PV will work well. And there is still a government incentive for solar thermal called the renewable heat incentive. That might pay you something like £200–300 a year for having a solar thermal panel on your roof. So it's worth kind of bearing that in mind as well. But still, for most people, solar PV is a better option. Next slide, please, Emily. And then just quickly before I finish, just obviously solar PV, solar energy is a really good option for a lot of people, but it's not for everybody. And there may well be, for some households, better ways of spending the money on reducing your energy consumption. So, for instance, I say fabric first. That basically means insulation, ensuring your property or your flat or your house is well insulated. Particularly if you haven't got loft insulation, that's probably the single most cost-effective thing you can do. Lighting, again, that's super cheap and easy. If you haven't got LED lighting, that's a really, really good thing to do that will pay back very quickly and cut your energy consumption. Plug load, that means anything you plug into the wall. So buying energy efficient appliances like television and dishwashers. I always look when I'm buying anything like that at how much energy they use. It's always on the energy label. Make space for biodiversity if you do have a garden or any kind of outside space. And then heat pumps. I mentioned heat pumps earlier because they work very well with solar photovoltaics. And there is a new, I'm not going to talk about that now because we've no time, but there is a grant scheme that the government's announced called the Boiler Upgrade Scheme, which comes online in April, I understand, provided it's not delayed, and will pay grants, I think, of up to 5,000 to install a heat pump. So something worth kind of bearing in mind if you are thinking of looking at a heat pump for your house. Next slide, please, Emily. And this, I'm not going to talk through these now, but this is just some useful external independent expert organizations with some really good advice on solar panels and solar energy. If you go to some of these links, I will paste them into the chat after I stop talking, so you can look at those in your own time. And so I'm going to hand back over to Emily now to talk through Solar Together.
Amazing, thank you, Tim. And as we've said, we will share the slides afterwards as well. So you don't need to open all of those links now. You'll get a copy of the slides this afternoon with it all in one place as well. So I'm now going to talk through a scheme called Solar Together that we're supporting as Hammersmith and Fulham Council. So Solar Together is a group buying scheme for solar panels. It's the solar photovoltaic that Tim mentioned, and or battery storage. Now, this is open to homeowners in the borough or tenants who have permission from their freeholder or landlord. Solar Together is organised and funded by Mayor of London. And then at Hammersmith and Fulham Council, we're supporting communications and promotion of the scheme to really drive local uptake, because this absolutely aligns with our climate strategy and how we plan to tackle the climate emergency. So I've just kind of listed out a bit of a who's who on the right-hand side, because there are lots of different organisations involved in this. So as I've said, it's Mayor of London and the Greater London Authority. They're kind of behind the scheme, funding it and organising it. An organisation called iChooser, they run the Solar Together scheme. So they run the website, they kind of manage the suppliers, they run the auction, which I'll talk about. So they actually kind of run and manage the scheme on a day-to-day basis. We're then helping promote this locally because we think it's a fantastic opportunity. And then a particular supplier will be appointed through the scheme to actually do the install of the solar panels or batteries. And again, I'll explain a bit more about that. So some of the benefits, some of these have been outlined already, but specific benefits of this group buying scheme. One is kind of leveraging or pooling your group buying power. So this means that, the more people that join, the more of a competitive price that you can get, because the suppliers will bid or do a reverse auction for all of those contracts. So really, by joining in with the scheme, you can kind of leverage that power of being part of a group. Second of all, this will help cut carbon emissions. As we've heard, increase reliance on UK and locally produced energy, but also cut carbon emissions, which will help further our borough's target. Working with trusted suppliers, so all suppliers who take part in this scheme have been independently vetted and approved to make sure that you receive a quality installation with those extended guarantees. We've heard from residents that this is one of the main challenges to installing solar panels, knowing who to go and who to trust. So you'll get that accreditation through the scheme. And then lower bills as well. So by generating your own green electricity, you'll have lower bills from year one. So how does Solar Together work? The scheme, or this round, is open for another week. So you can register your interest on the website, which we'll share, between now and next Tuesday on the 15th of March. So you can register for the scheme and put in some details about yourself and your roof and your property. And then on the 15th of March, these pre-approved installers will bid for those contracts, and a reverse auction will take place where the supplier who submits the lowest bid will be awarded the contract. So then you will receive a kind of personal recommendation, which will say, this is our offer to you, and this is how much we can offer you to install this number of solar panels on your property. And then it's absolutely up to you. There's no obligation to continue with this whatsoever. You can make the decision of whether that offer is acceptable to you and if that is something that you would like to progress with. And then if you accept, the installer will contact you, will survey your roof and set an installation date. So again, there's absolutely no obligation. If you're just interested and want to find out what the cost would be for you and your property, then that's what this process is really designed for. So I'm going to tell two quick stories from residents who took part in Solar Together last year. So this is Mark, who lives in Barron's Court. He had 8 solar panels installed last year, and he's talked to us about the benefits of having the app on his phone, so he can see how much energy is being generated at any moment, and also the confidence that comes with knowing that these are pre-approved suppliers and have been vetted, and that this is supported by the council. And Mark also touches on the cost here, that, you know, there was an expectation that having these 8 solar panels would cost £8,000 or more, but in reality, it was less than half of that. So much more affordable than he thought at the outset. Or James, another resident who lives locally near Brook Green, who again kind of emphasised the fact that this is supported by Hammersmith and Fulham Council, and, you know, we're vouching for that tender process, gave him confidence in signing up for this. And again, would absolutely recommend this to family and friends, because once those solar panels are up and running, there's zero hassle and very little maintenance as well. So how do you sign up or register your interest? The website that we'll share afterwards is solartogether.co.uk, and then you put in Hammersmith and Fulham Council and you'll be added to the local group of people who are taking part in this round. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Roy, who will talk us through some of the considerations you might like to make when thinking about your property and planning permission.
Thank you, Emily. My name's Roy. I'm just going to simply talk about the implications of some of the alterations that may be proposed. So question that we often get asked in planning is, do you need planning permission for solar panels? So if you take the next slide, please, Emily. Most domestic properties do not require planning permission. So for most people, I'd say that's good news. There are certain circumstances where planning permission is required. The government sets out in its legislation guidance on, or not guidance, actually legislation dictating what is permitted development, if you like. And there are some things you can do without the need to apply for planning permission. So next slide, please, Emily. So these are the things that are required. If you fail these requirements, then planning permission is required. So these are, if you like, the stipulations in the legislation which have been simplified and watered down, but essentially it's this shopping list that's in front of you. So if you are putting solar panels on your roof, they should not exceed the highest part of the roof. That's excluding the chimney. If you are putting solar panels on your building, they should not be more than 200 millimeters from the surface of the roof slope. And in the image on the right hand side, you can see there's obviously a cartoon image of a solar panel in blue. So what we're saying there is that blue solar panel shouldn't project more than the highest part of the roof, and it shouldn't be more than 200 millimeters from the surface. And then also on a wall, excluding the roof, which fronts a highway in a conservation area, there's no permitted development. So in other words, if you're in a conservation area and you wanted to put a solar panel on a wall which fronts a highway, that would require planning permission. Similarly, if your building is a listed building, then you would need to get planning permission for the solar panels. And also, if your building is subject to an Article 4, which is something that we use to maintain those buildings which have heritage value of some particular visual value, permitted development rights can be removed. And there are a number of those in the borough which relate to either a small group of properties or indeed in some cases some larger areas. So yeah, that's quite significant. So those are the key areas, if you like. Now this image here sets out, sort of in a general sense, a pool of properties and how that relates to your situation potentially. It's a traffic light system, if you like. And so what I've said essentially is that generally planning permission is not required so long as you meet the permitted development criteria. And most properties fall within permitted developments for their proposals which they're seeking to do. So that's a given, if you like. In terms of conservation area, again, another question we often get asked, my property's in a conservation area, do I need to get planning permission? And again, it's the same point that applies. It doesn't matter whether you're in a conservation area or outside the conservation area, these permitted development rights still apply. More than 50% or around about 50% of the borough is in conservation area. And the significant thing, I think, is that the point I mentioned in the previous slide is that if you're seeking to put a solar panel on a front wall in a conservation area and it fronts a highway, then that would need planning permission. Now the areas are highlighted in red. These are, if you like, almost like not necessarily saying no-go areas, but these are where permitted development rights have been removed in Article 4 areas. And we have 46 Article 4s in the borough. And then in relation to listed buildings, these are properties obviously which have heritage value, and we're seeking to ensure that that is maintained, and we have policies to secure that. But there are only a handful of those in the borough, 500 properties, you'll be pleased to know. So again, most of the properties in the borough are not listed. We do have locally listed buildings, but they don't have the same status. Next slide, please, Emily. So on top of the permitted development guidance, there is also guidance which sets out that as far as practicable, sites which have equipment that is, if you like, outmoded, need to be removed, where as far as possible, if it's no longer required, essentially to try and remove unattractive features. And obviously the photograph at the bottom there is an exaggeration, but it's just basically trying to give a flavour of the sorts of things we want to try and avoid. But essentially, equipment that's no longer being used, there's a preference to have that removed. Next slide, please, Emily. Now, when this process started, I think when grants are being talked about, we received lots of queries from local residents through our pre-application service. And what we found was that some people were finding it difficult to get advice because we were charging for that service. And so what we've done since then is to introduce a free advice service for those people seeking to secure advice on solar panels and other retrofit measures, which go beyond solar panels. And that advice is free to residents. So if you're unsure about some of the things that have been mentioned here, or you go online, you look at the information that's there, you're still unsure, you can actually contact us, and we are offering free advice to residents, which is intended obviously to be helpful because of the profile and the importance of this area, which is emerging in all areas of life, but particularly in planning. The legislation is still catching up with the national advice on energy. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is really just what I've said. Essentially, we've got a whole new climate change page on our homepage for the council, and it dictates or details areas beyond just solar panels. It also talks about air source heat pumps, insulation of materials between walls, cladding on buildings, and also it talks about triple glazing and double glazing. So all those sorts of measures as well, they all have permitted development rights that need to be noted and identified if you want to move those proposals along, because some of those things will need planning permission and some of them won't. Next slide, please. So again, this is just us basically saying we are here to help. We have our page, our planning page. We are happy to answer questions about the queries that people may have about these. And also, if your property is in an Article 4 area, there is some information on our website which helps you to identify whether or not your property falls in an Article 4 area. We also have information about whether your property is in a conservation area. But the reason for putting the Article 4 direction clarification there is because there are some things you can do still without the need for planning permission, but there are some specific things where rights have been removed. For example, it will say you can't alter the materials at roof level, you can't do any alterations at roof level, and those things may affect obviously proposals for solar panels. So hence the reason for that advice. Now there is a contact number. It's a generic number, so we find that people often have difficulty getting through to us on that number. So we strongly recommend that you contact us via email, and that's the planning email there at the bottom, which comes directly into our offices, or we're working from home at the moment, but it certainly comes into our inboxes so we can respond to those more easily. Next slide, please. I think that's actually it. Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Emily, Roy, Tim, and Councillor Harcourt as well. Looking at the clock, and we have plenty of time to dive into some of your questions, and you've been asking a lot of questions in the chat, which is great. Thank you very much. Let's start with a few questions for Tim, I believe. Rosemary wants, or let's actually start with another question. My apologies. Anne wants to know: do you need to have a smart meter installed?
I don't think it is compulsory to have a smart meter installed, but I think it would be advisable. It would be a good idea, I think, so that you know how much you're consuming, and then you can match that up with what your solar panels are generating. And usually, I think people who, I mean, I don't have solar panels myself. I would like them. I haven't got them yet. But usually, people install solar PV monitors as well, which will just a kind of little screen will tell you how much your system is generating at a particular point in time, and then you can match that up to how much energy you're using, and it just helps you control the system better.
Ted and actually a few others also want to know, do I need to have a hot water tank to make use of solar PV panels?
No, you don't. Definitely. So for solar thermal, usually yes, but for solar PV, there's no need to have a hot water tank. It can be a useful way of storing the energy. If you can't use that electricity as it's being generated, then one way of storing it is through a hot water tank. But there are lots of other things you can do with it as well. Like, as I say, kind of things like timers for your appliances and batteries. So it's definitely not necessary to have a hot water tank to use solar PV.
Great. Rosemary had an interesting question. She asks, can solar panels be installed elsewhere, for example, attached to a fence facing south?
I have never seen or heard of anyone installing solar panels on a fence. And I think probably in terms of the weight of the panel and the risk that your fence might get blown over, which obviously has happened a lot lately, I think probably not a good idea. I mean, they can, I think in some circumstances, be attached to walls, although the aspect is not ideal. Roofs are better. But yeah, I don't think I'd advise a fence. Sorry.
Phil wants to know, or he's interested in knowing about solar panels in blocks or flats. He says he lives in a block of 230 flats with a gas heating system. Would solar panels be feasible there?
I don't know if others have got thoughts on this, but yes, I mean, I think solar panels, it's definitely more complicated if you're on a block of flats, because it needs the approval of whoever owns the roof. So if you have, say, a shared freehold, then I think all the freeholders would need to agree to installing the solar panels. And I think for a scheme like Solar Together, they would probably ask all the freeholders to, that shared freehold association to kind of lead the application. But yes, I mean, blocks of flats, in a technical sense, there can be a really good option for solar PV. So a flat roof can be a really good option, particularly if it's on a tall building, because it's not overshadowed. It's not going to be, the sun will shine on it all the time. So provided that kind of ownership question about the roof can be sorted out, yes, it can be a really good option to follow.
Yeah, and just to add to what Tim said there, yeah, from a planning perspective, the permitted development rules are the same whether it's a block of flats or it's a house. So the rules don't distinguish between the two. So as Tim said, you can explore that, but the main thing is to make sure you get, in terms of installation, the right clarification of who owns the roof and all the freeholders involved in the property ownership. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yuna Jane wants to know, how much will typical solar panels help you save in energy bills? Is there an estimate we can give?
I think that depends hugely on the number, the size of your system, what energy bills are doing. And at the moment, of course, the cost of gas and electricity over the next year is absolutely rocketing. So a saving you got last year will probably be quite a bit bigger next year. And it will depend on things like, the type of panel and the aspect of your roof. From the research I've done, people using historical energy prices, people will quote a payback period of about 20 years as being kind of fairly typical. I think in future it's probably going to be, for most people, shorter than that, because electricity prices are going up so rapidly at the moment, and gas prices are going up really, really rapidly. But it's something that I think, after getting a survey done of your particular installation, you should be able to get a better idea of, but it does depend on a lot of factors, like your installation and that self-consumption thing I was talking about earlier, that's kind of one of the main determinants of what the payback will be. If you can use the electricity as is being generated, your payback will be well under 20 years. Whereas if you need to sell large parts of it back to the grid via the smart export guarantee, that's when your payback period is likely to be longer.
Great. We also have a few questions about batteries. Susan wants to know how large the batteries usually are and where you usually install them in the house.
I think there needs to be somewhere reasonably cool. I think they will normally be installed in the loft nearby to where the solar panels are, but I think they can be installed anywhere really in the house where you've got space, and they're not large. I mean, I think they're significantly smaller than the boiler, say, for instance. It depends on the exact size of the battery you install, but I think most people would be able to find a space for them fairly easily. It's not, I think, usually a problem.
Sort of a similar question about the panels themselves. Nicole wants to know if the panels can be installed in 2 separate areas and then have them hooked up together. So for example, on the roof and then an extension flat roof. Yes,
that's quite commonly done. And there's kind of, there's some discussions around, I mean, again, this is something I think a survey would need to highlight, but you can wire them in series, you can wire them in parallel. It depends on kind of whether those roofs face the same way and whether there's any overshadowing. There are things called optimizers, which I have to say I don't fully understand, but they help you if some of your panels have a bit of overshading. Then installing an optimizer can make the whole system more efficient, but you can definitely use 2 different roof aspects and wire them together, and that's a very common thing to do.
Great. And again, sort of related, John wants to know if there's a preference for installation, because he seems to have a pitched roof and a flat roof. Is one better than the other?
It depends on your pitched roof, so it depends on what the aspect is and whether it's overshadowed or not. So yeah, a pitched roof that faces south and isn't overshadowed, that's probably your absolute ideal. But if the pitched roof faces, if it's got a kind of north aspect, then a flat roof is almost certainly better.
Great. Moving on to Emily, because we have quite a few solar together related questions as well. There's one question about whether the solar together scheme is also open to council leaseholders, Emily.
So no, solar together is only open to homeowners or tenants who have permission from their freeholder, as mentioned at the beginning. But this is part of a wider strategy that we have for how we reduce carbon emissions across all of our buildings, particularly council buildings and homes, and get to net zero. So we're currently working on a retrofit strategy for all of our council buildings. So again, this is one scheme that we have for a certain housing tenure in the borough, but it's absolutely not exclusive of a much broader piece of work that we're doing in line with our net zero 2030 commitments. Councillor Harcourt, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that there.
No, there's nothing really that I can add to that. I'm not aware of any other schemes at the moment, but it's obviously something I think we will need to look at in the future. But obviously some of it's going to depend on the number of leaseholders that there are within a particular block, or whether it's a leaseholder who's in a street property and so on. So those are things I think we need to start discussing in more detail with the housing department.
Thank you.
Again, a related question comes from Neil. He asks, can a group of residents who are freeholders of a block or flats use the service, referring to solar together?
Okay, this is really going to test my knowledge of housing tenures, but Tim might want to jump in here. But I believe what we have covered today is that yes, if you have permission from the freeholder, then yes, you can install that. Tim or Roy, again, I don't know if you want to add more to that.
That's my understanding, yes. I mean, I've kind of looked at this kind of solar together questions, kind of basically say, provided you have permission from whoever owns the roof. So if you're a leaseholder, you would need permission from the freeholder. I don't see why a freeholder really should object, but it's something, yeah, you would need to kind of engage with the freeholder.
Just to add, sorry, just to add to that, yeah, I mean, essentially, if somebody is looking to put up solar panels, the intention, presumably, is to save money, and so that's welcome. But if you live in a block of flats, there are other owners or occupiers who live in that property, and you just need to negotiate with them and agree with them, you know, the steps forward, because it's about ownership and access to that roof. And if somebody has an objection to that, if permission is required, then there may be a problem, you know. But that's more of a land matter, land ownership issue, rather than a matter for planning or necessarily the objectives being set out here.
And Emily, maybe you can talk a bit more about the solar together process overall, and wants to know how long is the process from acceptance to installation? How long would that take?
So I saw that question, and I don't actually know, Anne, but happy to kind of follow up with iChooser and find out the average for you. I know that, you know, we get a monthly report back from iChooser about how many people have installed. And over the past year, we had 100 people accept the offer last year, and about 25 households so far have installed, but others are continuing. So absolutely spread over the whole next year. I think it's also up to you in terms of how quickly you want to move with that, and installation dates and things, but happy to take that away and follow up afterwards.
There's also been a lot of questions about conservation areas, which I believe Roy answered in his bit of the presentation, but do feel free to put your questions back in the chat if they haven't been answered. But maybe one question I wanted to pick up again comes from Eliza, who wants to know, how do we check if our property is suitable from a conservation point of view? Where do we best send them, Roy?
Oh, Roy, sorry, I just need to unmute you there. Roy, do you mind? I think it should come up and go unmute. No, is that not working? Sorry, slight technical issue here. Maybe, Roy, if it's not asking you to unmute, maybe we can just respond in.
There you go. Sorry, yeah. So you just repeat the question again, so I'm not sure what happened there.
No problem. Eliza wants to know, how do we check if our property is suitable from a conservation point of view? Where do we best send them?
You can just send an email to us at planning@lbhf.gov.uk, and we can answer specific questions on individual properties. We can do a search, but also more particularly if you show us the proposals or you've got some proposals in mind, so long as you're compliant with the permitted development rights, planning permission may not be required anyway. So the main thing in the conservation area is if you're putting a solar panel on a front wall which fronts the highway. So that's the main concern, but obviously there are the other standard ones which relate to the height, the 200 millimeters and the projection beyond the roof. So yeah, they can just send us an email, we can respond back. Okay.
Thanks, Roy. We also have a question from Cyrus, who asks if there are any house insurance issues with having a battery in the property, given that they might be a fire risk. Is that something we can answer?
I think, I mean, from what I know of, I think there are enough people now with solar PV installations and batteries in their house that I don't think insurers take a dim view of it being a fire risk. I think, to be honest, I think there are almost certainly other things in your house that are a bigger risk than any battery system you would have with solar PV. I think something like a dishwasher would be a significantly higher fire risk overall. So I don't think that would be a major issue.
So Solar Together on their online, on their website, they have a list of FAQs. So that's something that we can follow up with again and get more details on fire safety as well.
Thanks both. And Alice also had a question about conservatory roofs. She asks, can you replace a glass conservatory roof with solar panels? Are aluminium structures strong enough for solar panels?
I have never seen anybody do that. I would have thought in theory you would be able to put thin film or nanotechnology solar PV, which is lightweight, on a conservatory roof. But I haven't ever seen it done. I think it would be quite an unusual thing to do. I think normally people put them on kind of tiled roofs.
Thank you. And another one for you, Tim. Rosemary wants to know, are solar tiles the way for the future?
I am not sure is the honest answer to that question. I mean, at the moment, I think it's only something you would do if you were replacing your roof anyway, because the solar kind of PV comes embedded in the tiles. So you're kind of replacing the whole roof. I think if it's going to take over from solar panels, I think it's kind of many years away before it becomes cost effective, because at the moment it's a really niche market and there's only a couple of suppliers out there doing it. So I think for anyone who is interested in solar energy and is not imminently replacing their roof. Is, you know, the roof is basically okay and should last another kind of couple of decades. I think solar panels would be better. Whether kind of solar roof tiles are going to overtake. I mean, at the moment they're not efficient. So for a given area of roof, you can't get as much electricity. And again, that's probably something as the technology develops, you would expect them to become more efficient and cheaper over the next 10 to 20 years. But I think at the moment, it's probably quite a niche thing to do. And I haven't seen any, you know, I'm a bit of a geek and I look at buildings as I walk past them and I haven't seen anyone who's done it yet.
Thanks, Tim. Another one for you, Emily. So Vera asks, if PV technology improves and becomes more efficient, can the installations be upgraded through the Solar Together scheme?
That is a great question. Again, happy to research that on your behalf. I don't believe so. So I think that from what I know from the scheme, you can upgrade from having just solar panels to then add battery storage at a later date. But in terms of upgrading the specific scheme, I think you'd need to go into a future round. And then, you know, if that was a viable option, if that made sense financially in terms of the savings and the technology. But the scheme has a warranty of 10 years, minimum 10 years. But as Tim said, solar panels typically are expected to last, you know, up to 20, 25 years anyway.
Thanks, Emily. Another one for you, Tim. Are there any combo tanks that can work with gas and electricity? As many of us have gas, which is used mainly for the heating and hot water. So I imagine we will need to install a combo tank, is the question.
I saw that question pop up, and the honest answer is I don't know. I would think you could have a tank that would work with gas and electricity. I think it would be, I can't see anyone relying solely on solar energy for the hot water, because there will be instances where there's just not enough energy on a cloudy winter's day and you won't have any hot water. So yes, I would think there would be tanks available, but I would think you would probably in that instance need to replace your hot water tank. That would be my guess, but I can go away and do a bit more research on that.
Thank you. We did touch on conservation areas quite a bit, but maybe just coming back to one question from Peter, who asks, will conservation area designations stop one from installing solar PV? And if yes, are there plans to amend said regulation?
If you're not in a conservation area, the permitted development rights still apply. So even if you were to remove legislation to have for conservation areas, there still be restrictions that need to be complied with. The only difference in a conservation area is that you have one additional requirement, which is to make sure that solar panels aren't on the front wall. So as far as I'm aware, there's no legislation in the pipeline to remove conservation area restrictions. No, is the actual answer.
Roy, do you mind if I just ask for clarification between the front wall and the front roof? So if I'm in a conservation area and I want to have the solar panels on the front roof,
yeah,
how would that work?
Yeah, so I think in the image that was shown previously in the presentation, if the wall is obviously the vertical part, if you like, and the roof, you may have a front roof slope which fronts a highway, but the front roof slope itself doesn't actually constitute something that would need to have get consent for in a conservation area. Whereas if it's on the wall, as in the vertical part, then you would need to get consent for that. So yeah. Thank you.
We also received another couple of questions about the national grid. If you don't use all the energy created by panels, can it go into the national grid?
Yes, definitely. So this is the smart export guarantee I was talking about earlier. So you are basically, this is kind of the current government scheme to ensure that householders, homeowners can sell the electricity they generate back to the grid. But as I said, you won't be able to sell it the way markets work. You won't be able to sell it for as much as it would cost you to buy it. And this is why it's better to use it yourself if you can. But yes, it wouldn't need to go to waste. You can sell it back to the grid.
And picking up one of the earlier questions from Kieran, who asks, why can't solar panels be designed so that they replace roof tiles? So if fitted direct to rafters and not on top of tiles, then I imagine they would be lighter, so the weight would be reduced on top of the roof.
I mean, that's basically the sort of roof tiles that I was talking about. So that's the way, that's the kind of products the market has developed to replace solar roof tiles, to replace kind of tiles without kind of putting panels on top of the tiles. But you do have to obviously then replace your whole roof, which is not cheap.
Probably not, no. Antonia wants to know, if I want to attach PV to a hot water tank, are there any special requirements for the tank? Or as long as it has an immersion element, is it fine?
So it's a similar question we had earlier. And yes, I think looking at some information from National Energy Action, who are pretty reliable, yes, I think you can just, as long as your hot water tank has an immersion heater, I think it will then be compatible with a solar PV system. I think that's all you need to do, and then you just get a little device that works out when you're not using the electricity and uses it to heat your water. So I think you can then use that with your gas boiler, going back to the question asked earlier. But it's important because you don't need to have solar PV, you don't need a hot water tank, because there's lots of other ways you can use the electricity. You can use it to power your television, your appliances, and your computer, and your charge the battery in your car if you've got an electric car. So there's no requirement to have a hot water tank to have solar PV, just to clear that up. It's only the second technology I talked about, solar thermal, where you do need to have a hot water tank.
And maybe one final question to wrap things up. I've seen a lot of questions about solar panel maintenance. So Susan, for example, asks, what are the implications for roof maintenance on a roof with solar panels installed?
So my understanding is it's really very straightforward. I mean, I think if the roof is kind of not apt to have kind of leaves and stuff drop on it, which hopefully it wouldn't too much because it wouldn't be too overshadowed, you should hardly need to clean them at all. I think in some instances, some of the kind of slightly more, if you like, kind of installations that might be kind of near a tree might need cleaning once a year, but I think that's the most you would need to do. And I think in a lot of cases, they don't really need cleaning at all. So I think maintenance is, I mean, it'd be easier, I think, than maintaining a gas boiler, certainly, where you need to kind of get it serviced once a year by a specialist.
And I know we had a question earlier on Nextdoor about, birds nesting or pigeons and questions like that. So if that's something that you can talk to the installer about, and they can see, is it likely that actually your area and your roof would attract birds? And then you can discuss installing nets over the sides to make sure that it's kind of safe from nesting birds as well. Great. So thank you so much, Thea, for facilitating that. And thank you everyone for answering your questions. We're happy to follow up, as Roy said, one-to-one on specific planning questions on the planning@lbhf email. Just before we go, I would just going to launch a quick poll, which has got 2 questions, which we would love to hear your feedback on. How have you found this event? So just feedback on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being very poor and 5 being very good. How useful have you found this event? So that will really help us kind of tailor the session for next time and know how useful this session has been to you. And then the second question, again, we've had an amazing turnout today. We've tried lots of different things in terms of communications. So please, if you can just let us know how you found out about this event, that will help us spread the word for future climate action events as well. So thank you everyone for filling in that poll. We've got, about 40 people have answered so far. And so just before we wrap up, I might ask if Svea can share the link to our monthly email newsletter, which is called Climate Connects, in the chat. So this is absolutely the best place to stay up to date with any news about schemes that we have, like Solar Together, about webinars and events and information sessions that we have, about opportunities to get involved in local events. So it's once a month, but it's a really nice wrap up of council climate action and community climate action as well. So that is Climate Connects. And other than that, just a huge thank you to everyone for coming along today. That's our climate emergency email. So that comes through to me, and we'll get back to you on any specific questions, issues, or point you in the direction of the right colleagues around the council if you need to get in touch with us. And you've also got Roy's email from the planning session as well. But other than that, again, thank you to all of our speakers, to all of our colleagues, to Councillor Harcourt for opening the session today. And other than that, we hope to see you at future events. And thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, everybody. Brilliant.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a lovely day.